Captain David Greer, retired now for how many years?
Oh Lord, I don't know. 2020 it was, so it's been close to more than 4 years. You know,
As a
I think it
child,
was 20. I think it's 2020.
did you expect to work until 73?
They say it's not working when you're doing what you want to do.
Okay.
And yeah, it's been a job, a profession. And sometimes it was onerous, but I've done what I wanted to do with my life, and I enjoyed.
Can you unmute? I didn't mean to do that.
Unmute,
There
whatever
you
that.
go.
Okay.
No, I'm trying to update your name on here. Rename retired. All right. So that has been addressed. Sorry to cut you off right there in mid-thought.
That's quite all right.
Where were we?
We were talking about whether or not I was commenting on whether or not I knew that was a question I was going to work until I was 73.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I had no idea that, but I mean, if I expected to do something that long, and I enjoyed my profession, I enjoyed it to the very last trip. But the last few years, I think I particularly enjoyed it because I didn't have to be a captain. I did what I really loved doing, which was piloting boats on the river, and didn't have to tell anybody what to do. I got to enjoy the crew. I got to talk to old friends on the radio. Sometimes ride the boat with old friends, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Right up to the last. I left because COVID started, and I didn't want to be catching a towboat with a bunch of at my age with that business going on. That was at that time not a very pleasant way to go, with COVID.
Right. Well, I'm glad we all made it through and you're
I'm
available
glad.
to
I'm very glad we're still above ground. Yeah.
and that you're available to capture some more history that maybe we haven't
Yes.
covered in the many hours that we published with you. I was just looking through here. I see at least six, maybe 8 hours that we've published on my channel so far.
Really, that much? That's
I believe so. Let me check real quick. I'm showing just some quick math in my head. 1.5, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, probably 11, 12 hours almost.
whatever in the world did we find to talk about that much?
Oh, I just sort of opened the faucet, sir, and you filled the sink.
Well, shame on me.
Well, speaking of the podcast, of course, I know yesterday you just watched the episode I did with Captain Sam Schropp.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
wanted to know, guy, what that brought out of you, what that made you feel, any memories that
Oh
you want to
yeah.
discuss with him some more?
He and I had so many of the same experiences. I think it sounds like he came from the upper Mississippi, where I began my career on the lower, but worked some on the upper, some on the Illinois, some on a lot on the Ohio. And we worked with similar kinds of people. He got to work, I loved this, with this old steamboat mate uh, and I got to work with a couple of guys like that, you know, who I learned so colorful. I learned so much from them. Uh, and it sounds like we worked with the same kind of equipment, slinging steamboat ratchets. You know, that may be the cripple that I am today. I think carrying a full set of rigging, a steamboat ratchet on one shoulder, a homemade uh, wire, ratchet wire that you spliced yourself, and then carrying a sling with a chain link in it in your hand, and putting that on your back and carrying it to the head of the tow is something I've done more than once, and it sounds like he has too. So that was fun, and I agreed with a lot of what he said. About the sorts of people we worked with, how things have changed. uh, there. I found it really interesting. He and I would have had, if we'd worked together, would have had a lot to talk about.
And maybe one day in the not too distant future, we can get you both on here.
Oh yeah, well maybe you can fly me down to Costa Rica and I can go see. We can sit on the beach and talk.
We'll see what's in the budget.
Yeah.
So we talked a fair amount yesterday. Um, we covered an array of topics. Was there anything immediately sort of on front of mind you wanted to discuss first?
uh, well, yeah, I guess I, we, in doing this, I think you had asked kind of what was on my mind, and lately, uh, uh, a lot. We would have a lot to talk about if we started talking about history and the moment that we find ourselves in historically and politically and as simply as human beings who seem to have lived into this age, you know. But the tone of things for me, I'm 78 years old, and I'm okay. I've got certain things going on with me but everything seems to be under control. So I'll probably be above ground a little bit longer. I hope so, but I'm prepared if I'm not. But I have the last year. Has been a sadness about things because I've lost so many people that I worked with over the years, old friends. Oh, I lost one of my best friends a year ago, Grady Gibbs, who went to work. We worked in Venezuela together. And Grady, I've known Grady for years and years and years, and he's just somebody I admired enormously and loved, as a brother. We lost him. And then we've lost other people. We lost some Captain Tommy Simmons the other day. And I don't know what, and in the uh, website on Facebook where that gets announced. It was interesting to me that so many of the other old timers, when we thought of Tommy, we had to smile. Tommy was kind of a centric character. He was a character, genuine character, and people told stories about him. And I loved that because it's just exactly the way that you'd want to be remembered, by everybody. You'd want to be, most of us would probably prefer that when our contemporaries thought of us after we passed on, they'd smile, and think about things like that. And that was the way it was with Tommy. But then there's been so many people that I knew, and a lot of people I only knew as a voice on the radio. My generation of pilots, that was common, where you have close friends who you never met in person. You know, you talked to them on the radio, and yet you became friends with them. And that was true for a lot of us. And a lot of voices that I've heard now, all my adult life, are gone from the world. You know, and given the river that we navigated, uh, to me, every one of those losses, every one of those people that we've lost, it's always seemed to me it's like losing a library. The experience that everybody has is unique and singular. And of the river, when the subject of inquiry is the river itself, that's enormously because I've devoted my whole life to being a student of that. To me, that's extremely valuable. What did this person remember about this particular place? They have memories of people and places and things that nobody else have. And when they're gone, that's gone from the world, you know? And to me, that there's something bittersweet about that. So that's the tone of things for me lately, looking back, and that's one of the pleasures, the great pleasures of my retirement, is looking back at the past, at the life I've lived, at the time that I've lived in, you know, and trying to understand it, trying to place it in history, you know, trying to understand my place in things and what this means to me, you know, and to it's there's it's valedictory, you know, in tone, of course, but it's enormously fascinating to me. You know, there are so many answers that I'll never be able to arrive at. You know, there's so much that I won't understand. You know, and you see these books around me. You know, I've got a library here full of a lot of books that I'll never live long enough to read, but it represents to me an abundance, you know,
A capacity for knowledge. Yeah,
exactly an abundance of possibility.
I have the same collection in my house and
There's a
plenty of years to read them, but not enough time in my
We'll never get around to it.
right.
There's a Japanese word I don't recall for buying more books than you'll ever read. You know, and I'm certainly guilty of that.
Hmm.
But the Italian philosopher and novelist Umberto Eco comments on this. He has something like 20,000 books in his personal library. You know, and that's what he talked about how rich that was. Just having that enrich the human soul in a sense, and that and the miraculous. I mean, I look back at my life and think, wow, that was what a ride that was. That was kind of, you know, a wonder to think about. And I mean, there are as many screw ups in my life as there are in anybody else's, you know. But I there I don't feel any sense of regret about that. And I have lived through a remarkable episode in history too.
Well, tell me more about that.
Well, uh, let's start with, you know, I was born in 1947. You know, my dad was in the Pacific. You know, uh, bless his heart, I think the only living Japanese he actually saw was a big, this enormous man. He could have been a sumo wrestler, a prisoner that they captured trying to steal food, you know. He was in the quartermaster business, you know, but he liked to say that he had spent 4 Christmases in foxholes, you know, and he probably had. He comes back from the war, and you know, after World War II, we forget this. I think that the post-war prosperity that we enjoyed was in part predicated by the fact that the first world had been bombed back into the Stone Age. You know, the World War II, the Allies won that war because of the sacrifices that the Russians made. They're the ones who killed Germans and got killed by Germans more than any other group of people in that theater of the war. But they were traveling on Ford trucks, you know, and Jeeps, and using and the British were flying, you know, planes that created by Ford Motor Company, you know, and it was American manufacturing that won the war, that provided the transportation, that provided the ships, that provided the airplanes, provided the munitions, you know. And after the war, because we had two oceans separating us from that, the physical plant, the industrial plant in the United States was the only one left in the world. So we prospered. Uh, there's a book, I think I mentioned this, we talked about this. There's somebody else, I forget where it was, I heard this. A Frenchman, Thomas Piketty, in recent years wrote this very influential book called Capital. He's an economist, and it's I'll never read it. I've got it up there on the shelf, but that's to look at, not to read, and use as reference. But he suggests or says that for about a 25-year period from the end of the war until about 1973, that was the apex of this, that in the United States of America, working people, laborers, could build wealth through their own labor. That's not been the case any other time in our history. And it certainly has not been true since that started kind of to going downhill in 73. Politics changed. We can get into that later. But that is where I grew up. And my generation has enjoyed a season of prosperity, and possibility that no generation in the history of humankind, of the species, has ever enjoyed. It's been easier for us, and we've all prospered from it, whether we realize that or not. Uh, you have the creation of a middle class. You have reunion jobs where people can go to work and assembling cars on or something in Detroit and make enough money to buy a home, to so they keep their wife at home looking after the kids, and create a kind of leave it to beaver homestead there. And that we people can't do that today. Very few people can actually accomplish that today. You don't have the same middle class. That's all changed. But that was, and at the same time, we used a disproportionate amount of the world's resources that bring us to kind of a, they call it climate change, but climate change is kind of distracts from what really is going on. There's so many, they call the environmental experts talk about environmental boundaries. If you want the simple form of that, you watch David Attenborough's uh, uh, documentary on Netflix about breaking boundaries. That'll explain that to you in very simple form. It's actually very complicated. Uh, One of the boundaries, of course, is that we're in the middle of a sixth extinction. We're losing species at an alarming rate. We're crowding them out. Another boundary is population. We've got 8 billion people in the world right now, and according to demographers, by 2050, unless something happens, we'll have 10 billion people in the world. And that's going to change the political equation everywhere because most of these people are probably going to live in Africa, and it's going to change everything. And there are other, we've got, we practice industrial agriculture that's rapidly depleting, arable soil. Are we going to be able to feed future generations? How is our fresh water going to last? All kinds of things are going on, and we use the resources that created that. So we, at the end of my generation, we are facing an inflection point in our history. it's bewilderingly complicated, and which we're not prepared for, and don't seem particularly interested in preparing for it. It does not seem that we're so accustomed to, you know, what we have, that it does not seem that we can summon the will to deal with it. That's terribly interesting. Nothing I can do about it, but it's simply an exercise in knowing, or in human history. It's very interesting to me to have lived into this era.
Well, with social media today and AI and all that stuff, what's real anymore anyway, you know?
Uh, well, that's a problem. We can talk about that. You're introducing some philosophical issues that Americans in particular are very ill equipped to talk about and to deal with. I am ill equipped to deal about it. I mean, philosophy was one of my minors in college, actually religion and philosophy, and I've read about it, but I'm not an expert in it. I mean, my understanding of these things is a mile wide and an inch deep. You know, but you're introducing some themes that are really alien to the American sensibility. Now, more's the pity.
Do you have anything to speak on about it? Do you want to get into
Uh,
that right now?
well, I don't know. You want to talk about that right now? Or you want to talk about the river, and we can talk about that. It's a big subject, you know.
Okay, well, maybe I do have some more questions about the river and, of course, Boyce Upholt's book.
Well, let's
So
let's let's do that, and then we'll come back to that.
that sounds good. Well, getting back to then Boyce Uphold, of course, we did an episode with him
Yeah,
promoting his book before it came out. Um, I will confess I do have lots of books just like you, but I don't read much. The only time I read actually was on flights to and from Nashville for work, and on
yeah.
those weeks in the hotel. Well, after almost 2 years in the liquids department, I've traveled enough now to have completed Boyce Uphold's book. And the third section, which was focused on, like you and I have discussed a fair amount, old river control structure and what these human interventions have done to the river. I would like to know from you, and this may well have been captured on the many hours we've already published, but tell me again, say from Natchez south, um, what the river was and what it has become.
Oh, well, tall order. I I've got a good close friend in Baton Rouge who's in environmental business, and he sent me a link to get in on this conference that was going on. I only saw one morning session of it. Uh, by a lot of it was being done by people in from the Corps of Engineers. uh, these are all these people are real experts on the river. I don't know if they talk to, but they talk to a lot of academic people. One lady who was an expert on uh, I think the fish in the river. I don't know exactly what her title was. It's fascinating uh, study that of the native species, the species that are native to river. That was fascinating. Then another gentleman was with the Nature Conservancy, and he was looking at the whole system of the river, natural and all. And one of the sections that he talked about was navigation, because you have to say that the river as it presently exists as much as a creature of American agriculture as it does of anything else. You have from one end of the river system to the other, you have control. We have created a something and like and during the course of my career, I've seen this, but we have created a kind of drainage ditch. It's less a natural river and more a drainage ditch. And of course, one of the justifications for that is that we have something that no other continent really has, and that is a navigable river that cuts right down through the middle of the country, you know, through the floodplain of this river and the richest agricultural lands in the world. So that the modern river is a transportation network interior to the United States. It's not vulnerable out here in the ocean. It's not. It's. I mean, there's a famous statement that Lincoln made in the 1830s or 40s that all of the empires of Europe could not uh, lead a horse to take a drink in the Ohio River. You know, it's just impossible. Because so that if we fail as a nation, it's because of we do it to ourselves. It's because through suicide. And he's right about that. That's the value. And people, this was this plan, the Jadwood plan, to do this to speed floodwaters to the sea was created, you know, between two world wars. So that was very much in mind, this protected interior waterway through which commerce could move. And that's still the case. We
Now,
don't mo-
on that note, um, what do you think with the current workforce out here in the industry? What do you see is the value of the Jones Act, and is it preventing any measurable progress within the industry?
uh I don't know. I don't think I can give an intelligent answer to that, Uh I, I know that one of the things that Jones Act protects is that you can't bring uh foreign vessels or foreign if you're navigating these waterways, it has to be done by people who are licensed for those waterways. So it's not like I-30 and I-40. You go through Little Rock, and all of a sudden you've got all the trucking that comes up through I-30 out of Mexico, and from Little Rock to Memphis, man, that's you might as well be. It feels like you're playing bump cars, and at the county fair. All these trucks there because you've got people who are and you've got international commerce going on right, where you're trying to drive. And you don't want that on the Mississippi. It's hard enough as it is. So in that sense, the Jones Act, you know, is extremely important. Now, whether or not the people who uh, are our representatives these days will continue to understand that we're we're living in, whether we like it or not, we can get into this later. we're in we're an international economy. This is a global economy. Capitalism is not, the system. In the United States, it's global, and so that the imperatives of it are have changed radically to a great extent without most of us noticing that. So the Jones Act, whether or not the sense of the Jones Act will be can be sustained, I don't know. Now that's a question you need to ask, people with who have thought that through, in terms of the law and legal, and there I'm sure there are people within these corporations who have considered that kind of thing carefully, but I wouldn't be one of them. To answer your question there. Now, where were we? We were talking about what was it? Remind me.
I'm forgetting myself. We were talking about the sort of manufacturing of a drainage ditch, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what that's what we've got, a- and uh, it the part of the purpose, part of the great deal of justification for it, is American agriculture, and of course the petroleum industry too, because it's cheaper to haul these bulk commodities by barge, as long as you don't factor in the cost of sustaining this infrastructure. But there are other reasons for sustaining it too. But me when I worked for ACBL, we were first worked for them. We were owned by CSX Corporation, and I know at one time uh, uh, somebody said that the physical plant of ACBL was worth about $1 billion. But when you put it next to all of the other properties and entities that made up this railroad, CSX Corporation, we were a very slender, slice of that pie. So that I mean, we were almost petty cash, and this at that time we were the largest barge line operating. You know, so the these corporations that operate on the river, their cost of operations is 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 relatively small, relatively cheap in comparison to what they accomplish, which is moving, what, 2/3 of American agriculture, of export of grains and such to the sea. That's a very valuable thing, and that drives, the creation of this, because now it's such that except in extreme, river conditions, it's and we've got instrumentations now, we've got Rose Point and these kinds of things that make it easy. You don't have to be a student of the river, which for me, back in my time, that's what I felt defined a pilot, a lower river pilot, was being a student of that river. You don't have to do that, you know. So you've got bigger boats, you've got larger tows, and you've also, and this is interesting, my environmental friend in Baton Rouge sent me this thing that the Corps of Engineers sent out asking for comments. And we talked about this on the phone there, and they're talking about an anchor fleet as best I could ascertain, from what I read, this anchor fleet would be uh, below uh, Port Allen Lock, just below there, about that where the Ingram office is, or CSI, whatever it is there, whatever it is now. And their fleet's all down that shore anyway, but they're talking about bringing one about 7 wide up closer to that lock. And I was thinking, you've got a lot of people coming out of Port Allen Lock. They may have, a 6 pack. They may have, 4 or 5 long on oil barges, and there a lot of them are trying to come out of the lock and turn up into the river with a flood river. Now, if they're turning up into it, chances are they've got a tug helping them. But still, a flood river, that's a mill stream down through there. And I've seen them lose ground there. Also, if you're not able to turn up, you've got to go south, go down below right there, at the lower at Red Eye Crossing, and turn around and then come back up the river. You know, uh, and sometimes you're trying to steer out of that lock and get down on that left descending shore towards College Town, but you're going sideways at the same time. And in other words, an anchor fleet 7 wide is apt to be a problem. And they do this kind of thing all the time. They're talking about, and they may already have installed it, a new fleet up above Thomas Point. Big old fleet up that willow bar there. And I can't think of a. I mean, that's a pretty bad place to put a fleet to me. Uh, it's it winds up looking like they're at 81 Mile Point, where you get to your right, you wind up going up deep in that bend, you know. Maybe you wind up too deep and you're up in that eddy, and you're trying to get out of that eddy and you've got a fleet up in front of you, you know.
Where is 81 Mile Point?
81 Mile Point is uh, just above Donaldsonville, right there above Donaldsonville, below Geismar.
Okay.
You got Philadelphia Point, then you got to get around, then you got to set up an 81 Mile Point, then you
Wh-
got
Which
a lot.
which dock are you facing when you come out of there?
Which occupation what?
81 Mile Point, you said.
Well, you when you come out of 81 Mile Point, you got this huge fleet underneath 81 Mile Point. You've got a ship, you might have a ship, being unloaded over here. You've got Donaldsonville and the Fouche intake on the other side. You're coming out of Smoke Bend, and then you've got this long reach, where you've got then you got Brangier Point and Point Homus. You've got these wiggles here, and it's a lot of traffic. From Geismar south, you're in the combat zone. We used to say there's so much traffic that you've got to navigate, and it's complex currents and high water. It's danger. It can be a dangerous place, and that's my point is that they've loaded up. We've got this unnatural channel. It's a delta lobe, that we have that came into business just before Europeans came to the continent, and we have frozen it in place. We've straitjacketed between levees from Baton Rouge south, and where the current does not have room to spread. It's and you've got all of you've got 100 years of American modernity and industrial plant that's been created from Baton Rouge south to below to the head of passes, and this is where most of, quite a bit of, if not most of the wealth of the state of Louisiana is to be found in all of this floodplain that is basically an elevated river. In high water, you're looking down over that levee at somebody sitting on their front porch having coffee, and there's nothing between them and you but this earthen mound, a levee. So this is, and it is extremely swift. The higher, I mean, every foot as you approach the flood stage at Baton Rouge, every foot from the above there, the river gets more strange and unnatural. You've got currents that you can't even imagine. And we have been, I think it's a big testimony to the skills of my generation of pilots that nothing terrible, really terrible, has happened. We were talking, Captain Sam was talking about this incident there yeah, out at 26 Mile Point. The Crapel sinking and all that. I can picture all of this. I know just exactly what happened. I understand how that happened. You've got high water. You've got fleets over here, a bridge here, fleets up here. You got this big eddy up in the bend, you know, up where you coming off 26 Mile Point, the current's coming down, hitting the bend, it's eddying back upstream, and then you've also got an eddy up underneath 26 Mile Point. You've got a fleet here. You've got current. You've got a river within the river. You've got this great big tow, 7 long and 6 wide, that's not making but about 3 miles an hour, trying to get out of the way of a ship behind him and a boat coming south. And he's getting set up underneath this point. He's got that head out there, crawl completely sideways in the current, really, trying to get over out of the way. But at the same time, he doesn't want to get caught up in that, get that head in that eddy, because if he does, he wind up over on the shore up underneath, that fleet. All kinds of stuff going on here, there, and and it takes a high order of skill. When you've got these big rafts of barges, and we don't the basic. I'll repeat what we've said in previous uh, talks. A raft, a towboat, and a tow, and a steamboat for that matter, is the is Huck Finn's raft. It's basically there's an attempt to create lines, but has no keel that cuts through the current like a knife. It's flat bottom. It's rectangular in shape. It has no hydrodynamics to speak of. The idea is to be able to put as much cargo as you can on that raft, and only one and minimize the draft, because you have a river that is seasonal in nature to some extent. You have low water, you have high water, and that if you navigate these great big rafts, you do that. Mostly, you don't drive them like a ship. You position them in the current to let the current do the work for you. High water, if you've got 30, I mean, I did this for a living for 2 years, where you have a little bobtail 5,600 horsepower boat, and you had rafts of loaded barges, 30, maybe 35 barges, in high water, and, if you tried to steer something, you're going sideways. And if there's somebody coming up underneath that point, and it's a small tow, he doesn't have enough sense to know that you are basically trying to run over him if you can. You can't, because it's going to slide off. So he's in your way. And a lot of times, what these big tows will do most of the time these days is they'll back up and they'll flank around that point because at least they've got everything slowed down. And if somebody runs over them, they're not going full ahead. So a southbound loaded vessel, a tow like that is going to back up and float around that turn just to slow things down, to be able to avoid running into fleets, running into anchorages, getting run over by ships, running over small tows, that sort of thing. And he takes up a lot of room. Now, you get a ship that's drafting, that's on a keel, that's drafting 40 feet. He requires, there's different imperatives for navigation here. If he comes up the shore at Smoke Bend below 81 Mile Point, that he's to find a deep water, he's got to come up that shore, but he's got to keep rudder towards that bank because the sheer bulk of this vessel is causing it to shear away from that bank. So he's got to keep kind of holding her into the to that shore, as I understand it. I mean, you ask one of the Nobler pilots, he'll give you a better answer, but because I've never navigated a ship, but they have very different imperatives. And then you have these guys who have underpowered boats. They're good pilots, but they work in dead water in the canals mostly, and they've got tows that are really too large for their boats. Most very often, they don't work in current, so they don't really know how to get out of the way of these monster vessels, that can't move out of their way. So and then you've got fleets that spill out into the river. You got tugs coming out of those fleets with a barge on the hip, and it's like I swear, it run across your bow like a deer on the interstate. It scare you to death. What some of the things they do, and all of this is going on, and you've got docks, where they're loading chemicals and petroleum and whatever. And, you've got so much current that if you've got a big raft of barges, it just takes up, you can't believe how much room it takes up, how much room you don't have. It takes it takes a lot of skill and a lot of luck. And we've been really lucky down there. But you have these corporations who they see an opportunity. Let's put a fleet in here. They don't understand what it's costing, you know, the people out there on the boat. They don't understand that.
Well, on that point, I hope you'll remember Captain Schropp and I discussed pay and how in 1978 a professional deckhand or mate could have a very good life at home with those wages back then.
Well, when I started decking in 1973, I got right out of college. I went to work for Sun Oil Company, and they paid. I was just a clerk. I hated it, you know. And in '73, when they started, the oil crunch came first. OPEC got cranked up. They closed that office where I worked, and I was one of the newest employees. So I got laid off or fired, and I was I was happy to do that, to get fired. I hated the work. It turns out that episode of my life was pretty interesting. I'm glad I got to do that. But uh, it was, I had in mind I was going to go to graduate school, go on and get my master's in history, and I was thinking about doing that, but this was in like February or March So it was going to be, it would be September before I could go to, find a school to go to and get that set up. So I had to find a job, and I was raised around the river, and it just sounded really interesting to me. I had a friend who had a cousin or brother-in-law who worked for Canal Barge Company. Actually, I wound up working with his brother-in-law uh, for a long time, but I took a job. Now they didn't pay very well. I mean, I was probably, I don't know, I may have been making $10,000 or more working for Sun Oil Company in 1973, and all of a sudden, I was making about $18 a day working for Canal Barge Company. So I wasn't doing too good, for a long time, and I had to work a, a 30-15 schedule just to try to support my little family at the time. So I didn't do too good. Now, maybe in other places, you did better, but where I was, you didn't do too good. What happened is, to look at politics. When I started, they were building boats and barges as fast as they could, which gave a great opportunity. I started in March of '73, and I started standing watch and pilot as a pilot in July '76. And 1 year of that was as a steersman. So I had there was a lot of opportunity there uh, for me. But in the things started kind of going downhill, as Captain Sam talks about in the '80s. You had a lot of stuff going on. Jimmy Carter's embargo. You had the uh, the coal industry uh, changed, but also during the '70s, these corporations, these river companies, had overbuilt. They had too many barges in service. They had too many boats in service, and things kind of crash. You have ups and downs in the industry anyway, and this was one of those downs, and it lasted for a long time. Plus, corporations change. I mean, I get a little check every month uh, from a pension that I used to have. I get two checks. One a pension I used to have from Canal Barge Company, and one I had with ACVL. But they cut those out during the '80s and early '90s because they replaced it with kind of a casino style 401k, you know, that kind of thing. And they could do that, and the wages from 1981 until into the 2000s, they really climbed for people at the top, for the your CEO and officers, but it remained pretty much flat for working people. I took a summer and a semester off in '80 and did some graduate work at LSU. And I think my major professor, who was a full professor at LSU, he and I made about the same thing, you know, as captain and as full professor. We probably made about the same salary. Uh, but by the 1990s, that he had passed me, by quite a bit. I think he would, so that my salary remained flat. until and that was they didn't have to they and that was the you had this was the age, of course, of where you had people coming out of these business schools, with these business degrees that basically made them feel like they were qualified to manage any kind of widgets that presented itself. And yet you've got an industry where the facet of the industry that actually generates income could be 1,000 or 2,000 miles distant from the people who are ultimately responsible, for managing it. And these people did not really understand. And these farm boys, I've like Sam's talking about, I've worked with people who are functionally illiterate. There's a disproportionate number of captains and pilots on the river who have learning disabilities. Who I think the old captain that I worked for was probably had learning disabilities. What do they call it when you letters are turned around and upside down?
Dyslexia?
Dyslexia. I'm pretty sure he was dyslexic. Now, that didn't mean he was stupid. It just mean he was treated. They didn't understand how to teach people like that when he went to school. It just didn't mean he meant he had issues with learning, and school was a humiliation to him, to a lot of these people. And it was not that they were stupid. It was that they were not given opportunities that a lot of kids might have nowadays, to overcome those learning difficulties. So that you had some really smart people who were really gifted in what they did, but they could not sit down with you and talk about, something that somebody who's been to college is going to talk about. So, there was a class divide there. The people in the office looked at the people on the boats as lower class, and they weren't. They knew things, they had expertise that these people in the office really needed, but they couldn't do what they did. The CEO of ACBL could not come out there and take over from me on watch, and get a tow up and down the river. And there were things that I would see on the river that needed to be addressed, and he wouldn't understand that. So you had that disjuncture there, in between management and labor. And these people, I think they thought, well, this, we go out and hire somebody off the street and train them to be a pilot. And that's not the case. It is one of the becoming a river pilot in those days in particular, but even now, is entirely experiential. You got to have your hands on that stick to learn what to do, and there's somebody got to stand behind you, and tell you, oh no, do this, come on, a little bit more to the starboard or this or that, until you get the feel of it and get the sense of it and develop the eye for it. And that takes a long time. You can train a pilot to handle the equipment in a year, but then he's got to spend several more years learning the river and learning what to do about currents. He's got a learning curve. The first 5 years is very steep, and you got to somehow get him through that. So you want to pair him with a captain who he can get up in the middle of the night, who can come up in his underwear and get him out of trouble, you know. And he's got to make mistakes. There's nothing to teach you about handling boats like breaking up tow in the middle of the night somewhere and having to catch barges and dig them off and all of that stuff. That's a great learning experience. I don't recommend it, but it might be necessary. And and it takes a long time to enlist, and some of these people were able to do it because they were simply so talented. You're talking about Carl Page. That's one of those people who had that kind of talent. Just of course he had some great teachers too. He works with some people who were good teachers, but he's extremely intelligent man, and he's very talented at that. Now, I didn't have that talent; I had to work for it, but and a lot of us did. But it takes a long time. You don't train somebody to do that overnight. You can train a lawyer a lot quicker than you can a river pilot. And the people we work for did not understand it. And I think they still don't, even though they may have to pay $1,200 a day for a trip pilot nowadays to get somebody with my experience. They may have to do that. But they still can't go out on the street and hire somebody to do it. So that's something that Sam didn't mention. But then, isn't that the nature of capitalism? Where you create this, you get people, you sell things that are at a you buy things at a price that are cheaper than you can make them. You sell things at an at at Keystone if you can get away with it. You pay people less than their labor is worth. That's the nature of things. If you're an employer, if you're a capitalist.
And
So,
I think that angles us nicely into a potential philosophy discussion here.
okay.
And I could use a potty break. So you want to pause and come back?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
You pause and I will come back.
Yes, sir.
Okay.